The 5 compulsory books I studied in a course called Universal Literature in high school in Spain, in my case almost 10 years ago, were called classics, but they were all European. With the same logic, we call European music classical music, and we differentiate it from folklore, traditional music, and world music. Like the decolonial theorist Ramon Grossvogel, I am inclined to consider everything called universal, and that is in reality simply European, as deeply provincial, in the sense of small and limited. Ramon Grossvogel asks, how is it possible that the canon of thought in all the disciplines of the social sciences and humanities in the westernized university is based on the knowledge produced by a few men from five countries in Western Europe: Italy, France, England, Germany, and the US? How is it possible that men from these 5 countries achieved such an epistemic privilege to the point that their knowledge today is considered superior over the knowledge of the rest of the world? How did they come to monopolize the authority of knowledge in the world? End of quote. I ask myself, who produces knowledge? In what context? For whom? The existence of the subjectivized, disembodied knowledge is impossible. Knowledge is always anchored and marked by the subjects who produce it. The place matters in terms of what is produced. There is no pure, universal literature. The literature we read in the classrooms has not reached the compulsory curriculum in a happy way, free of conflict. Why, for example, in Spain, we do not study the literary legacy of the Roma people? And if we do, why do we study non-Romani authors who use artistic or literary forms contributed by the Roma people, but without recognizing their origin? In 1998, journalist Charlie Rose asked writer Toni Morrison, can you imagine writing a novel that is not centered about race? And she very elegantly answered that Tolstoy, Zola, or James Joyce also write about race. The person that asks this question does not understand that he is also racialized. Morrison means that the white person has naturalized its hegemonic identity, but the black person knows that this is just a mask. The white person takes its white gaze as default. Black sociologist Du Bois put it like this in 1897. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at one's self through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. The literature of those racially privileged has its own style and language. It is literature that likes to dress as cosmopolitan and universal. My reflections from my identities as a Chinese woman from Utiel, Valencia, Wenzhou, Spain, cannot be disguised as cosmopolitan and universal. On the contrary, they can be seen, if we follow hegemonic criteria, as examples of a particular and minority experience in the West, and this is how our literature is sometimes treated. The white gaze has never let me believe that my literature could be cosmopolitan and universal. The current sensitivity in Spain towards, in particular, Chinese women is still full of stereotypes and prejudices. Hypersexualization, fetishization, exotization, the stereotype of the delicate, sweet, obedient women, the association with the mafia or crime. Chinese and Asian women are not interchangeable or identical in our experiences and projects. We are not the same. We are crossed by multiple experiences, by our corporal and social diversity, our psyche, our class conditions, and different ethnic and national origins. But the Spanish society tends to describe a Chinese woman with the same attributes that will serve to describe another Chinese woman, a generalizing device that undervalues us and constructs us in otherness, in alienness. So I grew up believing many disempowering narratives about myself. And one of the best antidotes I found was to just look at my community, realize that my community is very broad, very diverse, and that all our experiences are valuable. Our bodies and our knowledge are socially marked by class, gender, sexuality, race, at least since modernity. Thus, it is not possible to write from any place. As there is no body without social markers, there is no literature without belonging. So what I'm trying to do is to produce literature aware of these tensions. But of course, there are many writers and artists that also do it very well and that are with me in these reflections. For example, Sally Wen Mao is a Chinese-American poet that published the poetry collection Oculus in 2019. And I think it's a poetry collection that is very aware of the paradoxes of seeing and being seen, the intimacies made possible and ruined by the screen. Oculus is a reflection about the hypervisibility of Asian women's bodies and the silence these figures suggest. So the very title, Oculus, already associates this work with the concepts of the eye and the gaze. And there are indeed two poems named Oculus in the collection. The first poem, named Oculus, is about the suicide of a young woman in Shanghai in the year 2014. She documented it on Instagram. There is another remarkable poem in the volume called No Resolution. It is dedicated to Ashley Han, whose father from Queens, Ki-suk Han, was pushed into the train tracks of an oncoming train. None of the bystanders tried to save him, but a New York Post photographer had enough time to take terrible images of the man trying to escape as the train approaches. So we have these images, right, of these Asian and Asian American people dying in this way, spectacular, hyper-visible, mediated by technology, deaths that still could have been prevented. Some Chinese people in Spain die because of street violence. They are victims of theft and vandalism in their own shops. About this reality in Spain, we lack images and words. Today, when I am in a coffee shop, for example, writing, which is my most intimate act in a space between the private and the public, I remember myself as a child and teenager reading and doing homework in the restaurant of my family. And although I miss it, I know that it was not a safe space for me and my family. Businesses of migrant people open to the public are especially vulnerable to racist and classist violence. They are insulted, robbed, killed because wanting some beer or some chocolate. On July 20, 2022, Feng Wang, the owner of a bar in my city, Valencia, was stabbed to death by a local man. Elena, his 22-year-old daughter, in a statement to the local newspaper, denounced that her father's murder stems from the aversion and rejection that some people profess against the Chinese population. She said, "My father is not a unique case, Violence and robberies of Chinese people are happening every day in Spain. The performance collective Cangrejo Pro, the first in Spain made up exclusively of Chinese women, has a piece about violence in Chinese shops based on true personal stories. I was able to see the piece twice. It is ironically called Vamos al Chino. Let's go to the Chino. So Chino is the name that many use in Spain to refer indistinctively to any shop or restaurant run by an East Asian person, and that carries racist connotations, even if many Spaniards will deny these racist connotations. In an interview I did to Xiao Xiro, founder of the collective, she told me, after the COVID era, 2 colleagues from Cangrejo Pro shared similar incidents with us. Their mothers, who own grocery stores, had almost simultaneously suffered robberies with violence. This is not an isolated case. This type of business suffers from a lot of insecurity, and some colleagues from Cangrejo Pro have experienced it since they were little. We felt that we had to do something about it, and that was our way, the only way to deal with our personal and collective need. What is the alternative? The police, who do not meet our needs on either a practical or emotional level? So the restaurant of my family was called Chinatown, and Chinatown, the English term for areas, neighborhoods where Chinese and Asian people concentrate in non-Chinese countries. In Spain, there is also a history of calling Chinatown, something like that in Spanish, like Barrio Chino, to neighborhoods and districts with businesses related to services of sex work, areas that in other parts of the world are known as red light districts. Barcelona's Barrio Chino, El Raval, or Valencia's Barrio Chino, the Belluters area, have actually nothing to do with Chinese people, and it has been one more way of stigmatizing Chineseness in the Spanish language. Although it is no longer in use today, the term Barrio Chino has been used in a pejorative way, associating illegality, drug addiction, degradation, dirt, poverty, lust, and illness with Chineseness. The restaurant of my family, the Chinatown, closed in 2020. That year, I found myself, like thousands of other people in the world, confined. But in my case, I was confined with my parents in our town, Utiel, a place sadly well known in these last weeks because of the terrible floods it has suffered. And I wrote the poem San Fernando 33, a love-hate letter to the restaurant. Its title is the street and number in which the restaurant is located. Maybe I am not from any continent, country, city, or neighborhood, barrio. Maybe I'm just from this tiny location, San Fernando 33, zip code 46300. So San Fernando 33 starts with some verses of an Asian American poet called Chrysanthemum Tran, and it says, if we are gonna suffer, we gotta do it over good food. And the poem says like this. My parents have a restaurant more than 20 years old, but for some reason that I will say is ethno-racial, it has never been considered an authentic local business. Where are you from? From Calle San Fernando, number 33. Where can I find you? On Calle San Fernando, number 33. If you're a customer, we'll tell you you are right, even if you are not. You'll find me drinking at some unearthly hour, finishing up the course, pretending I don't understand white European comments, and putting on a flattering accent. You'll find me watching the news from a country that is not mine, because no country is mine. You'll find me massaging my father and devouring a serving of lemon chicken we made in excess because someone made a telephone prank that they wanted it for carry out. The secret to this popular recipe is Fanta and tears of an Oriental migrant laborer. Papa, Mama, I don't want to go to China. I want to stay in Chinatown. I grew up in a chino, and I don't want to walk between nothing and grief. I choose nothing. Papa, Mama, I don't want to lose my home. I can't bear this loneliness. There are white people doing yoga in every park, following along to videos by Xuanlan. I won't say anything bad about Xuanlan, because Xuanlan is a vinyasa comrade with fluid breathing and identity. She's a French yogi, and women, both Asian and Western, and I also watch her classes in my house. I only have a house because my parents just sold the business. The old Chinatown is now called House of Dragon. De la Y say the menu is more authentic only because there's no daily menu for $7.50. In the end, to them, it's all the same, whether it's a walk, an Asian, sushi, a gym, meditation, or sexual tantra, so long as if the backpacking trip paid for by dad and mom falls through, they can show off on Instagram Live and stories. But somehow it's true that Calle San Fernando number 33 is still somehow my home. Because in those thousands of calls received over these decades, there have been various translations, many misunderstandings, constant reproaches to Movistar. Melancholy with oyster sauce, tasty dim sum made with sweet and sour happiness. So I'd like to thank especially to Lauren Schimmel and Julia Conner for their amazing translations into English of some of my poems, and of course to Martin, that I know has translated some of the poems also for some of his students. So this poem about my restaurant, San Fernando 33, is by Julia Conner, and she's a wonderful Chinese-American teacher and translator from both Spanish and Chinese to English, that just if anybody is interested, has a whole finished manuscript of my poetry collection in English and is looking for an opportunity to publish in it. Reading Sally, Wen Mao, and many others, I realized how much inspiration I drew from those very relevant Asian American poets. In some poems in Oculus, Sally Wen Mao uses the persona of Anna May Wong, the first Chinese American Hollywood star, to convey this apparent contradiction between the aesthetic hypervisibility and the hiding of the perspectives, voices, and narratives of Asians. In the poetic imagination of Sally Wen Mao, Anna May Wong is casted the same way as racist stereotypes in movies like The Last Samurai or Kill Bill. She even goes viral as a webcam girl. Again, the element of the camera is there working as a witness of Orientalist consumption and abjection. Sally Wen Mao also resurrects Ah Feng Moi, the first Chinese woman to travel to the United States in 1834. Ah Feng Moi toured the main American cities, being exhibited and displayed by the Carner brothers among various Chinese gadgets. The Asian products could be sold to the American white middle-class spectators that paid a ticket to see her. Aphon-Moy was considered both a magic being and a monster. This is the contradiction that Sally Wan-Mao explains in an interview with Jenny Xie. The racialized feminine Asian body is both a spectacle and an absence, competed and reviled at the same time. Aphon-Moy was being exploited, and as far as we know, was not recording or producing anything of her own. Every research material found until now comes from the perspective of a white man looking at her. So Sally Wan-Mao explains, "For Anna May Wong's voice, I looked through old columns she wrote for the New York Herald Tribune and biographies and wrote the poems from there. Aphon-Moy's voice was imagined on my part, so I took the facts. For example, she was pressured to show her bare-bound feet against her wishes, and constructed a voice from these records. In the newspaper stories that described her, her otherness was so emphasized that no one considered what her perspective may have been, how she processed whiteness. For the poet, there is a chance of reanimating both Aphon-Moy and Anna May Wong. There are clear limits, as documentation lacks critically. There is not an actual giving voice to someone in an imaginative, speculative exercise like Oculus, but there is a recreation, as the author states it, of a history more felt, not for the exploiters, but for the exploited. So Sally Wan-Mao's poetry collection is an attempt to resurrect and reconstruct lost voices, at the same time that it recognizes the silence and absence in historical archives. Her poetry is defending thought, discourse, writing, voice, words, opposed to the hypervisibility and spectacularization of Asian women's bodies. Dan Chiasson reflected it this way. Her book is in part a sustained defense of writing. Mao's poems intervene in a culture glutted with visual images on behalf of what she calls the self you want to hide. Sally Wan-Mao's book was an axe for the frozen sea within me, in the words of Kafka. And I would like to read my own poem about my own ambivalent relationship with words, that in Spanish is called Pero Habla. I've always had more respect for words than for my parents. I've always had more respect for those bitches that do periods at odd hours than for my parents. I've always had more respect for Fernando Pessoa than for my parents. Because Fernando Pessoa found words, and he had a good translator and a good editor. And my parents found European scam, desolation. My parents found broken words that hurt, small sores, oozing tongue. And since I didn't want broken words that hurt, small sores, oozing tongue, I tried hard to speak. I tried hard to pronounce the R sound. I tried hard to speak correctly. White was my accent and dominate the words that dominate my parents, that are dominated by the words that they dominate. And today, my voice no longer has color. My voice no longer has history. Nobody knows where I'm from, because in nightclubs, where are you from? On Tinder, where are you from? On the border, where are you from? In Spanish, ¿de dónde eres? In Chinese, 你是哪里人? In English, where are you from? And when my parents talk, where are you from? And when the streets talk, where are you from? And where are you going? Where do you live? Where are you from? I'm from fake Japanese passports and family savings. I'm from loans and letters that do not arrive. I'm from blood, duty, and beauty. I'm from faces like mine that whisper slowly, faces that hope that I understand. And although I don't understand, and even though they don't understand, although nobody understands, I only understand that my parents made me understand that I have to speak, speak, speak. It doesn't matter that we don't understand. Speak, speak, speak. And so I speak with fractured language, with broken words that hurt, small sores, oozing tongue. So I speak with broken language, and yes, my parents are proud of me. And Fernando Pessoa too, even if they don't understand. Everyday interactions are full of poetry. Likewise, everyday interactions are also rife with linguistic harm. Racism is contained within quotidian language, as I mentioned in the first poem I have read today, Toda la Vida, in which I reference to the Real Academia Española definition of negro and the ubiquity of the phrase trabajo de chinos. Poetry is a means to transform everyday language, and just as our everyday language permits my poetry, poetry permits my everyday language. If with poetry we can invent new ways to name our silenced realities, then they will be silenced no more. The fact that our quotidian language is full of racist expressions means that our society is full of racist expressions. So poetry can help us to rethink and reinvent it. All my work and life areas are deeply connected. My poetry relates to my journalism, teaching, research, activism, because all areas inspire, feed, and sustain each other. Last year, in the summer of 2023, software developer Raúl San Gonzalo and I released Sansoy Pixel Scenes, that is both a digital poetry collection and a wallpaper app for mobiles and tablets with animated pixel art scenes. Users, readers can read and listen to my work on my own voice. These poetry collections include translations into Catalan, English, and Mandarin, which are all credited to myself. Spanish, Catalan, English, and Mandarin are the 4 languages in which I consciously live. So even if I normally just write in Spanish, I wanted to experience the process of self-translation and to know more about the poems of those Catalan, English, and Chinese myself, that all myselves are somewhat foreign and local at the same time. Fortunately, I had the help of the translators Laila Benitez James and Ian Farnes for English, of my high school teacher Nestor Torres for Catalan, and of my friend, actress and writer Huang Yan, and researcher Song Yuyin for Mandarin. So they have been my other myselves for my other dear languages in which I am not proficient or fluent enough. The process was painful, joyful, and truly, truly enriching. Laila Benitez James and Ian Farnes had many smart questions for my English translations about what I meant in specific verses or with specific words, and I was surprised myself that even if I did not know the answer at first, I always came up with some explanation. And after all translations are interpretations. And even if there are a lot of things lost in translation, you can also gain a lot, right, with the translations and in the opportunities I had to recite in other languages, just like today I did, that it was kind of challenging and very scary. But I always enjoy the feeling. In the case of Catalan, with the help of Nestor Torres, I did a translation that kept close to the Catalan variant that we speak in the Valencian community, that is different from the one spoken in Catalonia. As I used to study classic Valencian poetry as a teenager, reading my poems in Catalan was again a wonderful experience. And lastly, in the case of Mandarin, the process was so beautiful because I have been also helping my friend, the actress and poet Huang Yan, with her poetry in Spanish, and having her in this project taught me so many, many things. So my friend's mother tongue is Mandarin and the dialect of her region. Her region is Jiangsu, but she writes mainly in Spanish, as well as a little bit in Chinese and English. And she started writing in this new language, in Spanish, when she migrated to Spain with 30 years old. And when she told me, well, you need a better poet than me to help you with this, because for now, you know, your Chinese poems just sound so foreign. I mean, they sound translated. And I was like, yeah, like, it's okay if for the Chinese audience feels translated. I mean, there is no way I can hide my foreignness. So I will finish my talk, and then we can open some space for questions and answers. But I'd like to read maybe one last poem, this time in Spanish, which is the last poem of Invocación a las Mayorías Silenciosas. And I would like to thank you again for your attention. El talante integrador de la sociedad blanca es una película de Quentin Tarantino. La sirenita no puede ser negra. Es inverosímil, ya sabe usted. No están los ODS y los negros no tienen cola de pez. Hoy invoco a las mayorías silenciosas. Hemos venido a robar los trabajos de los mejores ciudadanos, los que pagan impuestos y votan cada 4 años. Hemos venido a robar la manta en la que vendéis Nikes. He venido de un love hotel llamado Asia a robarle el primer beso a Harry. He venido convirtiendo crisis en oportunidad, apadrinada, tolerada y aleatoriamente parada. He venido a llenar de rostros orientales los catálogos de las ONG, mujeres emprendedoras con los ojos operados, niños lavaplatos explotados, CEOs de éxito, migrantes y racializados. He venido a construir en la plaza del ayuntamiento una estatua de Mao, a ordenar el viento y el agua desde Luanqipazao, a dar sermones desde el púlpito Tao, ke Tao fei chan Tao, Ming, ke Ming fei chan Ming, a vender citas previas para renovar NIEs y DNIs, a ver vídeos de Mishima Yukio hablando en inglés. Los fascistas de antes sí que tenían clase, joder. Como el mezcladillo de merca mujer, esa soy yo, portavoz del glorioso Partido Comunista. Llámeme Paloma Chen, Chen Paloma Chen, Cong Hui, Chiñola, Diáspora, Huai, Huaqiao, Huaren. Yo soy el virus. Confucio tiene la culpa de todo. Harrison canta My Sweet Lord en un pabellón rojo. ¿Qué es el arte sino plagio y decoración? ¿Qué es la política sino hashtags nutriendo la revolución? Hoy invoco a las mayorías silenciosas, hoy invoco filtro y traducción, hoy invoco espejo, contaminación, aullido de flamenco venido de Aviala, vociferio fluido en lo impuro, lo mixto, lo mestizo, el oxímoron, el crisol. Hoy invoco a mis hermanas silenciosas. Nuestra historia está escrita en varios idiomas, los que solo entendíamos de niñas. No nos pertenece nada, solo pertenecemos a la tierra y a la suave cadencia intraducible de las palabras. Os espero a vosotras y a las otras. Sí, a vosotras, a todas las de las mayorías silenciosas, las de las identidades fronterizas, las de alto al fuego, a vosotras, porque mi casa es vuestra casa, porque mi casa nunca está cerrada, porque nuestra casa es la única herida que deberá quedarse siempre abierta. Muchas gracias.
All right. What questions do we have for Paloma? Hola, Paloma. Muy buenas. Excuse me, I came in late. Actually, I have students from El Boraya. I used to teach in Spain, and I was calling them about the floods. So forgive me for my late arrival. And you might have said it, but I was just curious because in the poem you refer to Fernando Pessoa, who is Portuguese, if I'm not mistaken. So, in other words, when you were talking about poetry, finding your voice in these words, what was it about Pessoa that had such an influence on you?
I think that yeah, like during the period, I wrote this poem, so I was reading a lot of Pessoa's works. So I guess, yeah, like of course he's like maybe the national poet of Portugal, right? But for me, it was more about someone that I don't know, that is like this white Portuguese man that also has like some poems like a little bit like, yeah, regarding the colonial past of Portugal and a little bit like problematic, that I still deeply admire, with his vulnerability and with his, of course, like yeah, his magic words. So in this poem is like, yeah, trying to say that I always, yeah, like literally, I always respected more my literature, and that sometimes it felt so like my parents couldn't really understand, like different worlds, right? So in this poem, I'm trying like to do this, yeah, comparison.
More questions. All right, I have a question for you, Paloma. So you mentioned that you work in several languages. You mentioned Catalan, English, Spanish, and Mandarin, but that in languages other than Spanish, you collaborate with translators in order to fully get your meaning across. So I was wondering if you could, I know you spoke about this in your speech, but I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what is that process of collaboration like, right? What's your process when you want to produce a poem in a language that isn't Spanish? And how exactly does that collaboration with a translator, um, how does it play out?
Yeah, so all those poems was about this project, Sanso e Pixel Scenes, that even the title is like in English. And so actually this collaboration started like, we wanted, so it's a digital project, right? So, and this connects with some like some kind of other philosophy of the work, of trying to get out like the poetry outside the boring books, and sometimes not very accessible books, and trying to do this like digital collaboration. And this project started with um, some artists and a software developer that wanted to do this app with some illustrations, that these illustrations could get into conversation with some texts. And I got really interested by that. So I started to write some poems, and I just write in Spanish, right? So I was writing these poems in Spanish, but then it felt like that we have to have this app in other languages, right? Like English, okay? And then for me it was very important to do it, okay, if we are doing it like in English too, why don't we also do it in these other two languages, even if it's going to be like extra work and like that. So so my poem in Spanish, I just try with my best skills to translate into these other languages, but of course it's so hard. It's so hard, right? And I'm not a translator. I guess this is super clear, that I'm not a translator myself, and also that it's super difficult to translate your own things, even if you're a translator, right? So for me, it was also like this collaborative project of talking with people, that most of them are like people that are already important in my life, right? This thing that I sometimes say about writing for your friends, and also just collaborate with your friends. But yeah, it's difficult. And I think I was saying like at the last sentence of my talk, like my friend was like, yeah, but your poems translated, they are just like translated. And I was like, yeah, because they are translated, right? And I don't know, I'm just very fond of translations in general. Like when I was a kid and a teenager, I kind of always read writers that don't write in Spanish, but of course, like translated into Spanish. I mean, and this is a little bit like, yeah, like for some people, anti-intuitive, because sometimes they're like, well, but if you can like read it in English, then why you still want to keep it like in Spanish? Or sometimes with the movies, right? Like now in Spain, like everyone just wants to see every movie in original, like in English and with the original subtitles. And for me, it's like, well, yeah, of course, but I grew up with these dubbed voices, you know, like Robert De Niro sounds a specific way, right? And I miss that voice sometimes. Um, so yeah, and the process was very difficult. I mentioned it, like translators always ask very smart questions, right? Like very smart questions, like what do you exactly mean here? And yeah, like sometimes like, uh, I don't mean anything. But then you kind of analyze your own poem and you're, oh, this reference to this. And yeah, I think that that's the best of collaborating with translators, right?
Thank you so much. More questions for Paloma?
So kind of following up on Martin's question, do you feel like your voice changes when you read those translations? Because a collaboration is, well, of course, everything is an interpretation, right? But everyone is interpreting your original, which is in Spanish. But yeah, does that voice change at all, or?
Well, what do you
Yeah.
think? I have no idea.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I have no
I don't
idea. What do you
know.
think? My voice changes? I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not
The
sure.
poetic voice. I'm talking about the poetic voice.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, 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 yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. I'm not. Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. What do you think, Martin? Tell me some clue.
I mean,
And also, you have translated some of my poems.
I did, and I'm not a professional translator, so I just want to make that clear. Yeah, I translated. I know that a lot of the translations you shared with us are not published, right? So I wanted to make some of your works accessible to our students without, so I did what I could. And it was very challenging. I mean, it was really fun, but it was really challenging. There's so much in terms of the way that you have rhythm, right, in Spanish that's difficult to capture in English. And obviously, the way that you perform your poems, right, gives them a whole other life beyond what I think what can come through on a page, right? So there's just so many layers of meaning to capture there. So in some ways, I think your voice it can only change, right? That would be kind of my thought. But either way, it's always beautiful. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel a lot of the times that I'm just like doing jokes that I only understand myself, actually.
What other questions do we have for Paloma? Yes?
When you're talking about like translating and then digitalizing poems so it can be more accessible, like who is the audience that you're most trying to reach through the poems, or is it just like everyone?
Yeah. So yeah, that's the thing with this like digital poetry collection. I was thinking that well, when I was a kid, I was like saving all my money to buy very expensive books because it felt really, really, really expensive. And in Spain, for many just like migrant families, they don't really have that budget for books. I mean, when you start like working in the publishing industry and all of that, you realize that books are very cheap because everyone just gets very little money. But then you feel as a consumer or buyer or reader or whatever that books are really, really expensive. So I do think yeah, I don't know if this sounds correct, but like I'm quite a fan of just downloading books like the pirate philosophy. I mean, that's also maybe just a generational thing. Like when I was a kid, we used to pirate just like pirate. Is that a word in? Okay, pirate, piratear, right? Like through the internet, like many films and video games and everything. And I do think that for academic life, that like the ability to know how to get all. But of course, please, I'm not going to defend that practice. So go to your library first, right? But yeah, the thing about accessibility is like everyone is just, we are all the time reading on the smartphone, right? So, so that also really attracted me of doing that project, that you can just, be in the subway and reading poems. Right, what audience? I don't really know anybody that reads poems in the subway, right? Like nobody is reading poetry these days. But, and this project, I feel that is quite niche, because on one hand, you want to attract people that is into poetry, but very specific kind of spoken word and like anti-racist poetry, right? That of course I would like that more migrants and racialized people like me also read it. But then these illustrations are pixel art illustrations. They have this, because I have this collaboration with these artists that are pixel artists that recreate how video games looked decades ago. And decades ago it was because of technical limitations, but now they are like building this style. And for me, that also have to do a lot with my poetry, in the sense of like some topics like this nostalgia, this reimagining things, this trying to get this balance between modernity and like tradition. So yes, in some sense I was trying to attract broader audience, but then again, when I'm writing, and most of the time I don't think at all about who is going to read or listen to my poems. But the first readers, or the readers that for me maybe are more important, are my friends, like a close circle of friends that are just really, really into me or really, really into literature, right? And like, after all, a small circle of people that really care about your texts.
More questions? Yes.
In Professor Repanis' class, we watched you perform the first poem, the Since Forever one, at the Royal Spanish Academy. And obviously in that poem you talk about the Royal Spanish Academy, and one of the ways we interpreted it was like kind of referencing it in this way of them being outdated, or when you mentioned the gender neutral pronouns. So I was wondering what that experience was like of sharing that poem in that space, and the impact it had on you, or the impact you felt it had on the audience.
Yeah, when I have to do things that scare me a lot like that, I just tend to not think like at all about that, right? So I remember that I won this prize, and this award, okay. And yeah, then when I was in this contest, which is a spoken word contest, I didn't know that what you have to do, or like the award is going to the Royal Academy to read your poems. I didn't know. Then then they told me, and I was like, wow, okay. And then I thought that I wrote a poem, so this poem is specifically written to this performance. And yes, I just wanted to reference to be an institution that is very outdated, and like very old school, with many, not only like definitions, but also with their practices on kind of, I don't know, linguistic police sometimes. So I yeah, I was scared as so I was just reading that with my best poker face, yes, with my best poker face, and I really didn't know if somebody would like it. But then to that a small circle of friends that were with me when I everything finished, and they just told me that they were like so proud of me and that they really really liked it. And then I was like, okay, this worked. This worked because this couldn't. And and yeah, I think for many people told me that it was quite a thing. I mean, they liked it. Of course, a lot of people also ask me why you go. Is very hyper, yeah, like what, like very contradictory, right? That you are doing this, and but since then, I have not been invited again, right? So I don't think I'm. Yeah, maybe I'm in a in a list or something. Yeah.
Sorry, one last comment. First of all, I thank you for teaching in Arab about Palestinian poetry. I didn't know about that poem until now, until you just said it. I could find it on Google, so I want to thank you. Muchísimas gracias. But I can't find your poetry with the digital images that you were talking about. I tried searching for that, if you could mention that. And just as a final way to conclude, I find it ironic because as far as I know, this university is a simulacrum of Alcalá de Henares. And I'm thinking of Nebrija and, his collection, his contribution to the Spanish language, Castellano, and the grammar. And I think it's kind of quite poetic that you could challenge that legacy, even though this is a simulacrum of that location. But yeah, please, if you could tell me how to find your collection, I'll be so grateful.
Yeah, totally. Like that, I think that is also like important, like to point out, like right in which space, right, where you are. So also thanks for sharing that. So I'm here thanks to specific people, right, that are, I think, making this institution like super, like more open and like more interesting. So super great that. Yeah, so the Poetry Digital Collection is like an app, so you can find it or on Google Play or on the App Store if you have an iPhone. Yeah, I know that it's called Sanshui Pixel Scenes, so it's like SHANSHUI, like Sanshui Pixel Scenes. Yeah.
I can also send you the link later. I've got it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. Rebecca.
Thank you, Paloma, for your poetry and your performance with us today. I assigned the selection that Dr. Repines translated to my food cultures class, which is a first-year seminar. And I've always been really struck in your work by the presence of food. And so we know that food is a language. We know that food is a system of communication. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how you use food and the restaurant that you grew up in your poetic work.
Yeah, first, like, I'm kind of aware that some, again, like Asian American poets, like, also do a lot of work with food because for Asian community in Spain too, food is something that talks a lot, like, about our identity and our history, and also that thing about, like, in the specific case of Chinese migrant people, like the generation of my parents, like 80s, 90s, they came to touristy cities in Spain, like Valencia, Malaga, Alicante, to open primarily restaurants. After that, they opened other things, right? Like bazares and right? But for me, the restaurant has just been so important, right? In the sense of, I think I talk a little bit in the talk, like I remember me a lot of the time, like reading a lot, watching TV a lot, but always in the restaurant, just like a house that is open to the public. So I was not in pajama, but it felt like that. And also, so we didn't live there. We had like another flat where we right? Like it was very near, but the presence of the restaurant, because my parents worked a lot and everything, was kind of all the time. I have this memory kind of unblocked really recently, thanks to another friend that also experienced the same, and he wrote it. But because I kind of forgot it, but there were many nights we were at home, and in the weekends, my brother and me were like, yeah, we're saying, wow, so good. We are now like having a rest and everything. But then the telephone ring. So the telephone rings. So my mother asked us to go, right? And then, long faces and very sad to go again to the restaurant. So there was this connection, right? That when I was a kid, I never really thought about that, like never. But after that, I did encounter some other works that realized me that a lot of the experiences in the restaurant were important for me, were kind of, like things that I would like to write about. And I think some of you may know Chen, right? Like Gazpacho Agridulce, like this graphic novel, right? Where she is drawing and writing about her life in the restaurant. And I remember, I don't know if it was 2015 or before, when she had this Tumblr, and it was the first time I was seeing like these experiences in an artistic form, right? So then there is this connection, of course, like restaurant, food, and of course, food sometimes related to sometimes like my conversations with my brother. My brother, for me, is like one of the main connections maybe to China, because he was born in China and he came to Spain with 12 years old, and he was nostalgic and melancholic, and he was also trying to say, oh, but the food we have in the restaurant, Paloma, it's not real Chinese food. And I was like, what are you saying, right? So we had kind of very childish, but at the same time very profound conversations about the truthfulness, or what is makeup, or what is adaptation, or what is racism, or right, like all these debates. And so there is one thing, and then maybe not so. In some way, it has a relation, but in other way, I always had, just with my Chinese identity, I always had a kind of conflicting relationship with food, right? In some way, because of beauty standards. I think many women, we have a travel relationship with food, right? If you eat so much food, you are constantly hearing that. But at the same time, our cultures revolve around food, right? So there is a lot of ambivalences there. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, I think we've got time maybe for one last question. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, so thank you for the fascinating talk and the questions. I didn't mean to be the last question, but actually I read some of your poetry that I was thinking about home, because some verses you were referring to the particular address of the restaurant, right? So, and then that's one way to understand home, right? And you kind of talk about this question above, this sometimes very confrontational question about where are you from, right? Many times that carry a racist connotation. And then I relate to my own experience. How I was asked that question, but over the years when I stayed in America, now I'm a faculty advisor. Sometimes I will ask my students, that question, where are you from? And then some of them act surprised by my question, right? And some others feel, I don't know if they're offended. So I'm also thinking of, this question about where are you from definitely relate to home, right? So my question is your thoughts about who get to ask that question of where are you from? And then a particular scene I have in mind is Miyazaki's Spirited Away, that moment of Zen. I don't know if maybe some of the audience, actually I'm going to teach that next week, the following week. So Spirited Away, in this moment, you have this little girl confronting No Face. So this monster guy who's out of control, who ate a lot of stuff, caused havoc in this bathhouse, and then she kind of conquered that monster by asking, she's this very tiny, 10 years old little girl, and then she asked this monster the question of where are you from? Who are your parents, right? And then those very simple questions seem to kind of defeated the monster. So the monster, really, you see that his gigantic size get deflated. So I'm thinking of all those moments like that. So the related question is, okay, your thoughts about home? And then maybe there are two questions. Another one is, in this our age of global migration, and then you can think of we are all living in this kind of a homeless mind of modern age, if you think of that way, right? So when we ask this question of where are you from, what does that mean?
Wow. Yeah, I do think that because of how now is everything, like, right? Like this world, like this question got so complicated, right? Like before it was just easier because maybe I'm saying a myth, because I was gonna say like, yeah, because before we never migrated. Okay, that's not true. But now it's like more, right? More, it seems like more movement, more freedom or not freedom, or forceful migration. So this question gets complicated. And for me, there are so many possible answers because, for example, in Spain or in like everywhere, there are many people like me. I mean, like their parents migrated and they don't have at all a conflictive, or they say that they don't have a conflictive relationship with identity, because maybe they just say, oh yeah, I'm from China, and that's like, or not, or I'm just Spanish, right? So they don't mix, they don't think it makes sense to give like a lot of explanation. For me, this question also kind of troubled me. First, because of how many times I was asked and in what circumstances. Because I do think that, of course, I also get curious, like all the time, about the intimate details of everyone. Really, like a lot. Um, but I don't keep asking them the first time I meet you, right? Or if I encounter you on the street, right? Or if right? So for me, it was also a matter, again, of friendship, again, of trust, right? We need to build some relationship to know in which conditions, and maybe this sounds like too hard, but like to know in which conditions we are talking about. I mean, if you ask me where I'm from, and because I feel that my story is a little bit troubled, and I give you a little more details, like because my parents came and blah, 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 then tell me you also the same kind of information, right? I mean, where part in Spain are you from? But your parents also migrated, but, right? Because people just tend to, like ask a lot of questions without also opening themselves, right? And for me, it keeps like the relationship a little bit, disbalanced. At the same time, I do think, of course, that the question of where you're from is important. I love the movie Spirited Away. I really like it. I I think I don't. I think I remember the scene, but now I forgot like about the specific conversation between them. But yeah, in some sense it's important, and in some other sense it has kept haunting me, right? So I'm starting to think more about where are you now, right? So for me, it will always be this looking at some distant space that is important for my identity, is important for my family, but then it's even more important to look at the soil, right, that I am standing right now.
All right, everybody. I think we're just about out of time. Paloma, I speak for everyone in this room when I say it has just been a tremendous honor and privilege to be able to appreciate your work and to witness your moving performance. So please, everybody, join me in thanking Paloma.